Okay, so I think now is already the time. So good morning and good afternoon, good evening. It depends on where you are located. Today, we have pleasure to invite Professor Nick Obolensky. So Nick, if you are ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hung-Yi, and good evening or good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are in the world, to everybody. My background is really as a practitioner, and I guess although the book can sound quite academic, and although I do have an academic experience of being a professor, it's really based on a lot of practitioner experience, which really was born in the military. And what interested me is how to enable an agile, dynamic organization, which is absolutely critical when you're on a battlefield and everything is changing. Complex adaptive leadership, if you like, was a culmination of a lot of research, which really blended complexity science and, if you like, some ancient Chinese wisdom. The book was published in 2010. The title was not really well thought out. Complex adaptive leadership is not a very sexy title. To tell you the truth, I didn't really think it would go anywhere because complexity back then wasn't really talked about, but suddenly it caught this wave. So in 2012, we set up a company to take this thinking around the world. The book then was published on a much better title in China, Weilai Lingdao Li, or Future Leadership. I wish I'd called the English book that, but anyway, we are where we are. We started operating in China in 2016. A lot of my slides here are in Chinese because I understand the majority of people here are from China. So it's with the respect I do this. I cannot speak Chinese, but at least some of my slides are in Chinese. After we set up the Chinese operation, the Western operation, then a year later, beat a lot of leading international business schools around the world for the EFMD Gold Award for Executive Development. The EFMD members include in China, Zhejiang University, as well as Beijing, Tsinghua, CEIBS, in the West, INSEAD. We didn't expect to win the Gold Award, but we did. And I think it was due to this approach that I'm going to share with you and the fact that it can get results. In 2019, we got the ISO 27001 accreditation. And in 2020, we formed an international company to widen the international growth. And over that time, we've really touched several thousand executives with what I'm going to share with you. At the end of the day, though, you know, the ideas in the book sound great, but the fact is, you know, can it get results? So I thought, before I get into the ideas that I discussed in the book, I thought I'd just share with you some of the research that was done looking at the results. And there were really three levels that I want to share with you. The first level, if you like, is at the corporate level. The second level of research was done at the team and project team level. And then the final research that was done was at the individual. So these are just three examples of a lot of research that's happened since the book came out. So looking at the corporate level, about a year or two after the book came out, Blomberg and Oliver Wyman decided to retrospectively look at 5 of the key competitors in the aeronautical industry, and then over the 5 competitors, look at which ones demonstrated the CAL principles which are described in the book. And they plotted these against the EBITDA growth and revenue growth. And they found that the 2 companies that really seemed to be demonstrating what was written in the book a lot more than the others got much better EBITDA growth and revenue growth. A few years later after that in Russia, similar retrospective research was done by the Tomsk University, and they looked at project teams working on complex projects, software teams working on complex projects. And again, they found that in terms of motivation, knowledge management, process improvement, and quality, the project teams that were demonstrating the principles that were written in the book were operating at a far better level than those that were perhaps not demonstrating those principles. Those first 2 bits of research were retrospective. In other words, they looked at operations that were currently going on and then looked at it against the principles in the book. In 2017, research was done looking at a slightly different approach, looking at individuals who were taught this approach or who read the book and had gone through some of our programs, and then looked at how well they were operating using these principles in the book. So at an individual level, you can see that the individuals themselves were getting, individual leaders, I should say, were getting a lot of good results. You can see there that they were getting faster results, better work-life balance, etc. And also they measured the level of, if you like, financial results based on, leadership productivity, team productivity, revenue and balance sheet impact. And they found that there was a sort of 6-month payback on the total program cost, which is unusual for a leadership program. So essentially then, what we really need to understand then is, why is this approach working? What is the context? And why did I really write the book? And basically, what is the global context? And I think if we're talking about the future of leadership and the future of HR, which is all looking to the future, I think we need to also maybe take a look back at the past and see what's been going on. And essentially, for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years, this was how we communicated at a distance. And now in a space of half a generation, we have this, and a quarter of a generation, we have that. Interesting that the email uses an icon from the past. I think young people in the future will ask, what is that strange icon? It's the same for transportation technology. For thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years, the fastest way to cover ground was like this, and now we have this. And if you look at where money is spent on technology, because it's really technological revolution, and Hung Yi mentioned AI, which is just another example of that technological revolution, most money is spent on military technology. And as a previous user of military technology, I have a very simple view. It's designed to kill at a distance while you remain safe. And for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years, this was how it was done. And now we have this. Now, if we put this in a graph, this change that we have seen over a very short period of time is what we would call an anthropological shock. We don't feel it, of course, because we're the frog in boiling water. But this change is really, really radical. And this is the context within which we are talking about the future of leadership and the future of HR. Because the fact is, all of this change and many others have made the level of human awareness far higher. In other words, we are leading people who are far more connected and far more aware. What's interesting is 4,000 years ago in Egypt, there was only one pharaoh at any point in time. 1,000 years later, in a Greek city, there was only one mayor at any point of time. 1,000 years later, there was only one Roman emperor in Rome at any point in time. 1,000 years later, there was only one king in a kingdom in Europe at any point in time. And 1,000 years later today, well, how many CEOs do you have in your company? Typically, only one. In other words, we have changed the context of leadership far faster than we change our assumption. Our assumption of leadership is still based on hierarchy, leaders at the top, and this is a discontinuity. This is how we see organizations, and this is how we, if you like, develop leadership. And I would call this leadership 1.0. I'm not saying hierarchy is wrong. I'm not saying this is a bad way to organize. I'm just saying this lends more to the past than perhaps to the future. We call this leadership 1.0. Leadership is done by leaders. Developing leadership is about developing leaders. Modern day thinking on leadership can be traced to the 1850s, Thomas Carlyle. Most leadership theories look at how a leader should be. They say this is what a good leader is. And we've had quite a few, if you like, views on that. It changes from 1900s, the directive leader, transformational leader, servant leader, empowering leader, resilient, agile, etc., etc. These are all based on 1.0 thinking. In other words, leadership is done by leaders. And if you think about it, a lot of HR, traditional HR approaches are based on this thinking. To just give you 3 examples, competency hierarchical models. We have levels, each level has a competency. We measure it against an ideal because HR are very idealistic and have an idealistic view of what a leader, a good leader should be. And then against that, we develop leaders. Another example is salary structures. Typically salary structures, the higher up the chain you are, the more you get paid. Another example is how we develop leadership. We develop leadership by developing leaders horizontally. You know, the guys at the top go to a nice business school, the people in the middle will get CCL, and the people lower down maybe will get a local trainer. In other words, it's a horizontal approach. It's hierarchical based. Nothing wrong, 1.0 is still necessary, but it lends more to the past than to the future. So essentially what's happening in organizations, though, is organizations are becoming more complex. To deal with complexity, organizations are becoming more complex, and we need to move beyond the 1.0 to start thinking about cross-boundary 2.0. An example of that would be the matrix organization, where suddenly now reporting lines are going sideways. We would call this in 1.0 terms influencing without power, but we call this leadership 2.0. In other words, going sideways and outwards. So we need to think more than 1.0. We need to start thinking about leadership going sideways along the value chain and into the ecosystem. But it doesn't stop there. I have a thought experiment for you. They did some research looking at major successful change programs that were successfully implemented in large complex organizations. And what interested the researchers was, where did the solutions come from? Originally. So there were lots and lots of solutions that delivered change, but who thought of these originally? So they took every single solution and backtracked. Some came from the top, some from the middle, and some from the bottom. So the question I have for you, the thought experiment I have for you is, of 100% of successful change solutions, these are the answers, what percent do you think were originally thought of by people at the top? So I'm launching the poll. Hongyi, can you see the poll there? Is it showing?
Yes, I can see.
Great. So I'd be interested if you could vote, for those of you that can. I know some of you are watching this on a separate platform, but for those of you with us in Zoom, we've got 20 or 30 of you. If you could vote, what percent of solutions do you think were originally thought of by people at the top? I'm not talking about the direction or the vision or the strategy. I'm talking about the actual answers, the solutions that actually delivered the change. And this was successful change. So what percent do you think were originally thought of by people at the top? So I'm going to end the polling there. I'm going to give you maybe just a few more minutes if you're still not decided. So these were the actual answers. They were in the solutions, the actual answers. Let's end the polling. And I'm going to share the results. And you can see that most people, well, it's actually split. We have a split between some people think it's over 50% and some people think it's 10 to 20%. We haven't got time to discuss this. I would love to discuss this, but the assumption of a large number, the assumption of a high number, is that the leaders know the answers. The leaders know. And the assumption of a low number is that the leaders don't know. And what most of you are saying, 70% of you are saying, is most of the time leaders do not know. And I think the research that we've done shows that the actual answer is about 10 to 20%. In other words, leaders at the top of organizations today no longer know the answers, and they know they don't know. In the old days, they turned to God. Today, they turn to McKinsey. You know, if you ever wondered why are the consultants making so much money, it's because leaders know they don't know. They get the consultants in to help them find the answers. And where do the consultants do? They go to the people at the bottom and ask them, because that's where the solutions generally lie. So leadership today and in the future is about leading when you do not know, not about leading when you do know. And what we therefore need is what we call leadership 3.0. And this is about leadership going upwards. It's about leaders learning to follow the people they lead and followers learning to lead the people who lead them. And it's not, and I think, you know, 1.0 mentality would call this bottom up. This is much more fundamental than bottom up. This is about leading upwards and being prepared to be led by the people you lead, and also having the honesty to say you don't know. And it's not 1 or 2 or 3, it's 1 and 2 and 3. And what we have then is a dynamic, and that's what we call leadership 4.0. Leadership 4.0 is 1 and 2 and 3. So we're not saying that, and this is, if you like, self-organization. We're not saying self-organization should replace hierarchy. I'm saying self-organization and hierarchy can coexist very successfully. For those of you who have read, for example, Reinventing Organization, Frederick LaRue, you know, he talked about the red organization, very, very hierarchical, moving all the way through to what he called a teal or blue organization, self-organization. We like to talk about a rainbow organization. This is where hierarchy and dynamic self-organization coexist. This is a much more complex way of looking at how things work. And to help us, we have a new science called complexity science. Not many people have heard of it, but what I'd like to do is share maybe one aspect of complexity science, which is biology, but it also has roots in chemistry, physics, mathematics, neuroscience. So this is hard science. And what the science shows us is that complex dynamic systems have inherent self-organization based on a few simple rules. And here's an example. This is 300,000 birds flocking. And you can see that's a very complex, if you like, pattern, if you like, of these birds, which are flocking with no leadership. And all they are doing, it took 10 years to work it out, all they are doing is following 3 simple rules. And those rules are separation, alignment, and cohesion, with an underlying purpose to survive. And you can see that separation and cohesion are misaligned. So another thing that the complexity science shows us is that the simple rules and simple principles can be, if you like, in contradiction or in tension. And we'll look at that a little bit in a minute about how that can be applied to organizations. But before we go about how this is applied to organizations, let's look at how it can be applied to a human endeavor. So I have another thought experiment for you. I'd like you to imagine that you are on a tennis court with 30 people spread at random. Okay, so you're standing there and you've got 30 people spread at random, and everybody, including you, needs to pick 2 people at random, but you're not allowed to indicate in any way who they are. So you don't know if you've been chosen, and you don't know how many people have chosen you, or indeed if anybody's chosen you. All you know is the 2 people that you've chosen at random from the 30 people standing around you. And then everybody's chosen their 2 people as their secret reference point. And what everybody now has to do is to position themselves at equal distance at the same time from their 2 reference points without talking about it. So you can see this is quite complex because I've chosen 2 people who've chosen 2 people who've chosen 2 people who are moving. So mathematically, this is very complex. So the question is, you know, what do you think will happen? Let's do another poll. So I'm going to put the poll up here, and if you just give me a second, here we go. And hopefully you can see that poll. If you've seen this exercise, by the way, because, you know, I introduced it many, many years ago to leadership development, so it's doing its rounds. If you've seen it, please don't vote. But if you haven't seen it, what do you think will happen? Do you think it will just go on forever with people moving around like birds flocking? Or do you think it will settle after a few hours or an hour or after several minutes? What do you think will happen? So if you could all vote, and then we'll see what you think will happen. We've got most of you voted. I'm going to close the voting. If you haven't voted yet, give you a few more seconds, and let's end the polling. And we can see that most of you, at least if I will think it will go on forever. So why don't we see what happens? I'll run this video just for a few minutes, just to see what happens, and then we can draw some conclusions.
I'd like you to position yourself at equal distance from those 2 people. You're not going to talk about it, you're not going to discuss how you're going to do it, you're just going to do it. Obviously, if they move, you'll have to adjust. Once you're at equal distance, you can stop, but as they move, you have to start again until you get to equal distance. Equal distance doesn't have to be in between, so if it's this gentleman and this gentleman, just by doing this, I'd be at equal distance. Okay? How long do you think this is going to take? Let's see. Okay, guys, have fun. Use the space. Let's go. Time starts. it's looking good. It might fall apart a bit, but don't worry. It might fall apart a bit again, but don't worry about that. Is that it? Are you all at equal distance? Yeah? Honest? Yeah. That's very good. That took you just under a minute. What would have happened if we put one of you in charge? Why don't we have a seat and talk about this?
And everybody laughs, because if we put somebody in charge, especially if they had a 1.0 view of leadership, they'd probably be still out there trying to sort it out. So what enables that to happen? What enables those people to do this? This is where we have the 8 principles that are needed for self-organization and agility. And you can see, rather like the birds flocking, they're in slight tension. So clear feedback on the one hand, but a tolerance for ambiguity on another are in slight tension. And this is why we use the Tai Chi tool, or the yin yang, to show that these principles are for hard, for soft. Haven't got time to go into the details of all these principles, because they do have slightly different meaning under a complex environment. For example, objective setting is done by the individuals as much as the person is in charge. But what's interesting is the research that we've done on these principles over the years. And on our programs, we have 2 self-assessments, one looking at the team, which people fill out against these principles, and the organization, one looking at their leadership, if you like. And what we find as far as the team and organization is concerned is most organizations have a good score. 70% is not a bad score. So this is from over 600 executives, 24 countries over the last 2 years. Most organizations, most teams get a good score. The highest scores are normally purpose and freedom, which is interesting because a lot of HR talk about purpose-centered leadership, but actually I think they may be barking up the wrong tree with that one, because implicit purpose is generally quite well embedded in organizations. The problem is actually too many rules and not enough clear feedback is going on. And this is not the feedback in terms of the leader giving feedback. This is feedback where everybody can see what's going on. So generally, though, the score is quite good. What isn't very good, though, is the score for leadership. 47% is a low score. In other words, 53% of the time, leaders are more disabling than enabling. 80% are far too busy, 30% are micromanaging, and 20% don't let go at all. And the reason for that is they don't understand complexity in a VUCA world. They're trying to stay on top of everything. So when you begin to understand the science and you begin to apply 4.0, you can get much better results, much less stress, but also ask more interesting questions from an HR point of view. So from an HR point of view, you know, what can we do to motivate people is a 1.0 question, but a 2 or 3.0 question is, well, what can we stop that demotivates? You know, most people are motivated. What are you doing that's demotivating? Another HR question is, well, how do we develop talent? You know, talent development, big deal. How do we develop talent? Very important. But another question is, well, how can you get talent to develop the company? This is rather like Steve Jobs saying, we do not hire smart people to tell them what to do. We hire smart people so they can tell us what to do. Another question is, well, how can leaders empower subordinates? Well, that's a 1.0 question. A 2 or 3.0 question is, well, what can we do for subordinates to empower leaders? And the hint there is, well, maybe we should stop thinking of our leaders that they know everything. They don't. And we know they don't know. So we should stop thinking or expecting them to know. That's very empowering. And finally, you know, this issue of engagement, how can we engage more? Well, what are we doing that is disengaging and stopping it? So I'm not saying that 2 and 3.0 questions should replace 1.0. I'm saying for leadership in the future and HR, we should start thinking much more widely about these traditional views. And that is what Leadership 4.0 is about. It's a dynamic. And going back to the original 3 things I looked at, in terms of competency models, maybe we should move away from what and simplify it and have how at all levels. Same values at all levels, rather than different competencies at different levels. Perhaps we should start thinking more widely about how we reward people and what we do about salary structures, and perhaps involve more decision making in how bonuses are shared out, and maybe looking at output rather than input. If you look at most HR management structures, they're based on input, job descriptions, where you should turn up, how long you should work. These are all industrial age thinking. We need to move away from that and start thinking about the future. And finally, on leadership development, which is our field, instead of looking at horizontal leadership development, maybe we should start thinking about vertical leadership development. In other words, taking people from different levels and putting them through the same program together. And we find multi-directional leadership development gets much better results. I'm very conscious of the fact that we've had COVID-19 as a sort of big black swan. It's not a black swan, but that's another story. But it certainly caught a lot of people unawares, and it also gave us the opportunity to do some research. So what we did is we went to some of our alumni, about 100 of them, who'd been through our programs 3 or 4 years ago, before COVID, and asked them, to what extent did applying CAL, complex adaptive leadership, help you with COVID? Did you manage better than the people around you? And 75% said yes, they were performing better than the people around you. And what we then asked is, well, what do you mean better? You know, where were you reporting better? And you can see these are the top sort of 4 or 5 benefits, with over 60% saying much better team engagement and better results, higher productivity, less stress, faster results. We then asked, well, what are the other leaders doing then? If this is how you're doing, what about the other leaders, the people who are not doing so well? What's the problem there? And you can see here, this is some of the comments we had, you know, micromanaging, loss of control, pressure on this virtual working, lost in the details, and this constant search for control and certainty. And I think what complex adaptive leadership gives us, and the future of leadership, is about leading with uncertainty, being comfortable that you don't know, navigating the uncertainty rather than trying to manage it. So I'm conscious that we're kind of like at the half-hour point. We had to end on time. So if you need more information, we have a LinkedIn page. And also for those of you in China, we have a WeChat page. There are a lot of articles there with more information, as well as obviously on top of the book. But I'm very happy to take questions, and I'll hand over to Hong Yi. And I hope that was my 30 minutes a little bit compressed.